Hello,
Hi,
how's it going?
fine. How about you?
Yeah, good here. How you doing, Jaden? Can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
I just said I've had 1.5 hours of sleep.
Oh no.
Damn.
We got some coffee there, I saw, or it looks like that. Some warm drink.
Yeah, no caffeine because I hope to go back to bed. So I'm pretty excited to share a link to this repo for the agenda item. Where should I share this? We're in Zoom, huh? Not very used to Zoom.
Yeah, you can put it in a chat in here, but it'll be lost. Might be better to add it as a link to the live notes.
In the notes. Yeah, good idea.
Somehow GitHub has been quite messed up today for me. So a lot of stuff
really?
hasn't been working.
Okay.
And I haven't been able to edit myself in to the agenda.
I haven't heard from Ivan if he's coming, but other than that, I think we have everybody here who said they would be coming. Yeah, I had a chat with Ivan. It looks like he's just gone back from a trip. So he said that he thought he could make it, but I'm guessing he's probably just recovering from his trip still. Great. So should we get started? So first of all, let's go through just whoever's here on the agenda. Say hi. I think we know each other here, but refresher. I'm Sam Parsons, PayPal/Braintree. Work from the U.S., Iowa. Jaden, I think you're at the top of the list anyways. So.
Jaden Sarek. I work on the GraphQL multi-part request back in Melbourne.
Benji?
Sorry, I'm a little disorganized. I've just jumped off another call. I'm Benji. I will be working on GraphQL. I'm taking a little break at the moment. And I also work on the GraphQL suite of tools.
Right. Hi, I'm Benedict. I work on PHP tools with GraphQL, mainly Lighthouse.
Awesome. So does everyone have a link to the notes Google document?
Yeah, got it.
Anyone want to volunteer for note taking?
I'll do my best.
All right. I can spot you as well a little bit. Another point of order, I am kind of looking after my kids. They're quiet right now, but I may get interrupted, in which case just kind of carry on without me. So I'll be back if that happens. Great, so let's look through the agenda. Yeah, so pretty much the only thing that we've got here is a test runner for kind of proof of concept progress that Jaden, you had added. So I think we'll start with that. Is there anything else to add to the agenda that people want to talk about? All right, I'll take that as a no. All right, so I think Jaden, over to you.
Awesome. I'll just tab out of Zoom, bring up my own README. Yeah, so pretty much I tried a whole bunch of stuff earlier in the month. I even had the idea to try creating a GraphQL API that you would like communicate with mutations to like test a GraphQL endpoint, but I ended up abandoning it. And I've come back to I guess, kind of the original vision of the group of having a mostly CLI focus, but also the similar functionality available as like a JavaScript API that just pretty much runs a bunch of tests and you know, reports to the console and exits with a error code, process error code. So this is like pretty useful for people to use in CI. I was halfway through just before I joined this call creating like an example repo with it working. So I guess you can see what it looks like in the console when it's doing its thing. Because I realized at the last minute that just looking at all of the tests is probably doesn't spark the imagination, because it all, the tests like run as child process and get snapshotted and stuff. But I guess unless there's, one of the goals that I had for this is that it would be lightweight enough that it will be runnable via NPX. So the footprint of this in Node modules when you install the package is less than 1/4 megabyte, which I'm pretty happy with. So I've got in the test, let me just see. So I'd started with 2 example tests because we haven't yet defined exactly what our, maybe I should screen share, I think. How do we do that? Share screen. Desktop, I guess. Cool, can everyone see?
Yeah.
Yeah, the API is documented, but to see the work in progress tests that I've done, so here's the schema, and I just had a field that resolves all right and a field that resolves an error, just to base the proof of concept tests on. And where am I? Yep, so these are the 2 tests that I'd added. I just tested a query field resolves okay, and we're pretty much just checking the JSON structure that is returned and the HTTP status. And I test a query that resolves an error, and we're checking that the status is actually still a 200 even though there was an error, and just details about the the GraphQL payload and the response. We can build these tests out just by sort of replicating how that works and just keep pasting in more tests, and we can update the schema accordingly. One of the cool things about this is it's actually like a lot easier than I thought to test arbitrary servers, if they're a JavaScript server, that is, because the schema is exported. So you can just import that schema and then just start the server and then off you go. So you can see an example of that here in the tests of this tester in the index here, yeah. So here's a compliant Koa app. It's just using GraphQL API's Koa execution with the schema, which is coming straight from, you know, what the public could import as well. That's the test schema that we're exporting from this package. Yeah, we're just running. So yeah, this is snapshotting the like CLI output of the test itself. So it's not very exciting to look at.
What library is that using for snapshotting? Is that like a? It's not like the snapshot. It's like a different dependency.
So this snapshot. So I've previously published a standalone package that just does a snapshot assertion. It's very similar to other snapshotting approaches where you just have like an update snapshot equals one environment variable, and it updates the snapshot files. But this is sort of very isolated and lightweight approach. Sorry, I'm losing my trains of thoughts. With snapshots. Sorry, continue.
I have a question about the scope of these tests.
Cool.
Are we looking to basically trust that the GraphQL schema works and only test the HTTP layer, or are we looking to reach a little beyond that and test things like, the aliases work and things like that?
Alias. Oh, like
field alias.
Like the GraphQL schema. Sorry, the GraphQL spec stuff as well, not just the HTTP. I actually did hit that dilemma a little bit because it does come up almost straight away. There's very little actually that the HTTP spec has. It's like the status and.
I think it would be a good idea to make a decision on that, but I'm a little bit like, I feel like it should only test the HTTP part, but equally there are things that we are potentially adding to GraphQL imminently, like defer and stream and things like that actually relate to the transport layer. So those things, maybe we do need to reach a little further. So yeah, I'm just interested to hear, what have you found so far? Have you found you've been okay just trusting the GraphQL schema, or is there things within there you've needed to test so far?
Well, we control the GraphQL schema, so we can, and that's just using GraphQL JS, and all of the JavaScript-based GraphQL servers, you can pretty much just dump a GraphQL JS schema instance in, and off it goes. So we can do whatever, throw errors or do any tricky things in the resolve functions of that schema we're exporting.
So how are we intending to then share that kind of schema with the other languages like Ruby or PHP, for example? Yeah,
so having that schema exported that way kind of creates a public contract as well. So we could generate like an SDL and people could see, I guess, what the resolvers are meant to be doing, so that if they were to then, do it in a totally different language, they know at least what schema they need to be creating for the tester to be able to run. I haven't bothered to do an SDL dump out. I've just got the GraphQL, the JS schema exported, but people could also, you could always have layers over the top of this base package that would, import that schema and convert it into something else.
So the purpose of that schema is to have some resolvers that do act in a specific way. Is that like why we even have it?
Yeah, because we have to have some schema or some structure, I guess. I mean, just looking at this, query a field that resolves okay. Our tester needs to send the request. And so we have to hard code in there what that query is when we're sending that request. So the server on the other end has to match that request.
Well, what we can do is we can use the introspection queries for a lot of testing. And that way you can test arbitrary GraphQL servers which do not implement specific fields.
So a great way of doing that potentially, for example, would be to query things like the introspection fields. We can't do that necessarily for the error field, but for other ones like __ type name, for example, could be a replacement for OK, and then any GraphQL schema should support that.
Yeah.
Is there is the scope of the HTTP specification like, does it care about what kinds of errors occur? Or can we just send an invalid query that triggers a syntax error and be good with that?
Syntax error.
I mean, like some implementations will give you like for example, Apollo client will give you 400 responses if you give it a badly formed query. Things like that. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Well, when I'm not particularly precious about these two tests. So, I mean, I figured that the group would now have some infrastructure to imagine whatever tests we want to put in here. I just figured that these were some very sort of basic examples of something that works nicely and something that has some sort of an error.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great start. I'm trying to think because like a lot of the servers in the Node ecosystem, for example, they all basically work in the same way. So I think we're going to get similar results on them. I think one of the values that we get from this project is going to be testing the other ones that weren't like basically originally based on Express GraphQL. So the various other programming languages. So I think if we can try and minimize the amount of work that those folks need to do in order to use the test suite, that would be great. So if we can do things like using the introspection fields that should always be present because the GraphQL spec says they should be, instead of using a new OK field, for example, that would be beneficial. But the errors one is actually a really interesting one. I think quite a lot of the servers, even in the Node.js ecosystem, have a way of effectively taking the errors and augmenting them or pulling extra information or removing information from them. But I believe that is it the GraphQL spec or I think it's the GraphQL spec says what the errors should have, like things like path and things like that.
Yeah,
but it
definitely.
is possible that the servers may actually break these promises by manipulating those errors. So it might be worth pulling that part, even though it's part of the GraphQL spec, it might be worth pulling that part also into the HTTP test suite.
Yeah, so I had accounted for that consideration in this example test. So because the message itself can be obfuscated, the test just checks that there is a string of a message, but not what's in it. And it also doesn't deeply strict equal the entire error sort of object because there could be extra fields that servers put in there. So it just checks specifically for the fields by spec that need to be there.
Awesome. Yeah, this looks quite good. Sorry, I wasn't reading it in full before, but yeah, this looks great. I have another question. So in the most recent GraphQL specs, we've specified the errors a bit more strictly, and we've talked about this extensions property, I think, where you can add extra stuff. So for things like that, I don't think a server is non-compliant or like should error necessarily if it's still putting fields at the root level of the error, because that was historically what would happen. And the extensions thing is like how you do it modern. Do we have a way of effectively maybe raising a warning as opposed to an error? Or maybe it is just a different test case and you're like 97% compliant rather than 100?
Yeah, so if you do a console log or a console warn or something in any of these tests, that will be printed out in the report, indented underneath the heading of that test. So it won't create a non-zero exit status, which is what you want, but you can put messages in there conditionally during the test running.
Fantastic. That sounds like exactly what you want, like advisory, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we could have like different levels of errors. And I think like actual error and warning are pretty much what we would need. And they map quite nicely to things that we define in the spec as must or should.
So one of the things that I considered when setting all this up, and I went down a bit of a rabbit hole because I was thinking about publishing some updates to like the actual dev tools that I'm using in this proof of concept. Shoot, I've just completely forgot what I was talking about. Sorry, guys. I've had one and a half hours sleep. Sorry, continue without me and I'll remember what I was going to say. So the JavaScript API that this package exports, it reports to the console. But what would have probably been better is that JavaScript API will return like an object that has sort of the results of all the individual tests. So that way you could potentially use all sorts of different reporters on top of that result. Now that gets quite nuanced and complicated, and I had some great ideas for doing that because when you're running the tests, you want to be able to do console log warnings and things in there. And if there is an error or the test is just broken and there's, or console logs from third-party code, the way it currently works is quite nice in that it's all properly nested and indented in the console. So at the moment, there's a very similar behavior like between the JavaScript function and the CLI. They've worked quite similar. The only difference is, of course, the CLI, it just exits with a 0 status, but the JavaScript function, it sets a non-zero status if there's a failure, but it also throws an error, which is configurable. But I figured that I could at least get like a first generation out that has all the tests, and we can use this infrastructure to build out the test we want. And then if it is a feature that we want to be able to have different reporters on the results of a test, then I can work on the infrastructure and maybe publish some updates to the dependencies.
Yeah, I guess maybe throwing an error is not the most convenient thing to do, but rather just returning a list of result objects, which are either warnings or errors, or just no results at all.
Yeah, I think maybe if you return an object that then has a status on it, like status pass or status fail, something like that, maybe that would be better. I'd also caution against setting the exit status code in the library where you are not actually controlling the exit. I wouldn't do that particular one single line of code. I would comment that out and only use it on the CLI personally.
Yeah, so the reason it's like that is because of like the testing like framework that I've got to work with. So it's that code is not actually in this repo. Yeah.
So question, are we looking at extending this to WebSockets at this point, or is that going to be something that's a little way down the line?
I think we should make that as second pass. I mean, technically, it's not HTTP, right? Like, it's a different.
It's the protocol over HTTP. You still start with an HTTP payload.
Yeah.
This actually came up today. I had some users of some of my other packages asking about WebSocket support and stuff, and I was saying, I don't want to build a bunch of stuff without a proper, GraphQL Foundation stamp of approval sockets protocol. But then I couldn't actually find a very obvious place to link to the public to track progress for that. People intuit that maybe this working group is responsible for it, but the HTTP in the name, it does sort of ward off that idea.
Again, I don't think so. WebSockets are an HTTP protocol. They're an upgrade for existing HTTP. I think this is actually a common issue. This is why Express GraphQL doesn't have WebSocket support, is because there is no official GraphQL project that has it. I think a lot of people just use Apollo's WebSocket solution, and they do have their WebSocket protocol quite well documented. So it might be worth speaking with Apollo and basically seeing if that can become perhaps the official one, maybe through this working group or maybe another. I think it's appropriate for this personally. Maybe go from there.
I would very much love to see this working group or another definitely put something out there as well. I just from my own experience, because I went into a real deep dive around the Apollo protocol. I wanted to publish my own implementation on their protocol. There's problems in its design as well that haven't been solved for a few years. So I don't think we can just drop it in and use it. There is a particular GitHub issue that's a security problem I could probably dig out. But that's a whole kettle of fish, I guess, a full agenda item on its own, discussing the viability of it using the Apollo protocol.
Well, it's possible if we were to take it over, we could potentially do breaking changes that fixed any of those issues whilst formalizing it through the review process. It might be a good starting point rather than starting from scratch potentially.
Well, Apollo's already broken their own protocol on at least one occasion, so they're up to, I think, the second major iteration. But they sort of just didn't, because they didn't really document the protocol. And for a while, the old sort of GitHub READMEs actually had the way the old protocol worked, but they'd actually changed it in the source. So they could control pretty much the whole ecosystem that was using it. So they just sort of just changed things on the fly. But that caused problems for other people outside of Apollo.
I think to your point, Benji, there's certainly a need for it, right? It's just, I think like one of our early goals with the working group is to get a 1.0 version of the spec out. And I think WebSockets shouldn't be part of the 1.0 version, because I think it is a big topic that I think we're gonna need some time. And it's already taken us we're like 2 or 3 months in, and we don't have like the basic spec published. Not feel bad about that, but I think these things take a while. And if we add in WebSockets, I think it will take considerably more time for that 1.0 version.
I 100% agree with that. With that said, I think we should think about how we would go about doing that at this stage, because it will help us to not build the HTTP tests in a way that would then make adding WebSocket support later more challenging. So I think it's worth at least thinking about a little, but I absolutely agree it shouldn't be in the first set, and we will be looking at that once the 1.0 is out properly. We don't need a solution, we just need to think what the shape might be and make sure that it could slot in, is what I'm thinking.
Well, I guess running tests on WebSocket support is going to have to be a separate part of the test suite anyways, since it's not going to be a feature that every server has to support. So that's we can still have a unified CLI or API for that, but it can live in a totally different module or something. So we're not bound technically.
Absolutely. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that WebSockets can also be used for the same queries and mutations that HTTP on its own can. So it might be that we could leverage sharing some of the tests, and really it's like a case of send this over any transport and check that the result is this. And then the way that we check that for HTTP versus WebSockets could be different. I think being able to share those tests and just use this one schema for everything could be beneficial. But yes, I agree that they will be separate, and some won't need to implement subscriptions at all.
It would be pretty easy to just add subscriptions to this current setup. So maybe on the CLI, if it, you could have 2 arguments if there's a different endpoint for the socket interface or something. but every unit test has its own, like you can script whatever you want in there. You could do a WebSocket setup.
I think speaking to what Benji, what you just said about the sending with the different payloads over different mechanisms, I think we should really try to keep the tests really shallow in that regard. So we don't have to test every feature of GraphQL that's within the scope of the spec. So we can stop at a certain point. And the tests don't have to prove that the server is 100% correct in every way, but just that the basics about the HTTP hold up.
Well, I think this is a great start. Very good job. Well done.
So I want to just polish a little bit to do with on a meta level, the testing of the tester, just so it's a little bit easier to iterate. Because I've noticed in GitHub Actions, only on OS X, there's flakiness. One in every 4 for some reason isn't happy. I don't know why. It's fine on the others. It's fine in Linux. So yeah, if the group's interested in this approach, I can continue to refine it.
Yeah, I think this looks really good, Jaden.
Thanks. I would like to as well make maybe a screenshot or a recording or something of what the UX actually looks like in the console when it's putting out the report. Maybe if you look at the build, like the build status badge, you click on that. It uses the similar testing tech to test the tester. So the reports look quite similar. They're colorized, and you don't have an example of one going wrong. But it's got code coverage at the bottom. That won't apply for consumers because we only put code coverage on for our testing of the tester. So they'll see all the way up until the green, like yada yada out of yada yada test passed.
Cool. So one of the things that was on our, maybe I'll just share my screen here real quick. Gotta find the right tab though.
Oh, guys, sorry, I totally forgot about taking notes. I was digging into the test repo and totally got distracted with that. Sorry.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
And you should see the actions from last meeting.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm trying to pull this tab over here. Okay, that's better. All right, that's probably more normal format. So yeah, I think that is a POC running for first pass at that. So that's great. One thing that I was supposed to do kind of on my docket, which we'll carry forward, is kind of to go through and get a list of tests, kind of that high level from the spec, just kind of in a way like abstract and ignoring like whatever test framework we use, what are the sort of things that we're going to test. So I was going to do that, so I'll still do that. Anything else that we need to review here? There's Ivan's one. He's not here, so.
I glossed over it a bit, but on the topic of the graphical integration, I looked into it and got really bogged quickly because I couldn't figure out how to do it. So unless I get some very close collaboration with someone that knows that what the new graphical setup's like and how to use it, I didn't see clarity when I was investigating.
Yeah, it's certainly undergoing a lot of change right now. I'm, as I mentioned, taking a little break from that project at the moment because I just have too much other stuff going on. But I'm sure that Ricky would be more than happy to help you get up and running with this. He will be extremely passionate, I think. So let me know if you want me to do an introduction, or you can just reach out to him directly if you're comfortable doing so.
Thank you.
Them.
So potentially in a future version of the testing package, once I get the JavaScript function to be like not reporting straight to the console, we could totally then use this package in an integration into GraphQL. So what our work now doesn't exclude that from being a future possibility.
Do you want to, that sounded kind of like an action of some sort. Do you want to capture that here, Jaden, or?
Yeah, so there is a JavaScript API exposed, but we could just maybe expose a better one in the future.
Cool.
To your idea earlier, Benji, as well about not like having our special test schema. If we decide that the final tests we want don't actually need a special schema, we can introspect anyone. Our infrastructure doesn't need to change at all. You know, we still need a test schema for our testing of the tester. So maybe we don't need to publish that schema anymore. We just drop it from the public API. But yeah, we can just rewrite the unit test to not use.
Yeah, I think it would be quite cool to have effectively a zero effort tester that, like, basically anyone who wants to evaluate a GraphQL server can just spin up any GraphQL server and run the basic test suite against it that only uses the main supported things. That's not going to be the full suite though, but it's enough to maybe say, oh, it doesn't do this, or it does this in the wrong way, or whatever. But then in order to do things like the error testing that you've added, which is critical, absolutely critical, I think, that will, I think, need adding special fields, because I don't think with introspection you can necessarily fire custom errors. You can do things like firing errors due to validation failures, which would be in the base state, and you can just do by requesting things on the introspection schema that do not exist. But when it comes to actual like custom user errors, I think we're going to need a custom schema. But I'm just basically saying, if we can keep that schema as absolutely tiny as we possibly can, that's going to be beneficial, because it's less to implement in all the different languages.
Well, as we're writing out the test, then we can keep that goal in mind, and then, you know, maybe by the end of it, hey, that we don't even need to expose that schema in the public API. Maybe we do find clever ways. But if we do have to, like, the infrastructure's there, it's fine.
I'm not actually sure that we need any special fields for testing errors, since of course there are different error conditions which you might have because of the contents of a query, but I don't think they are really a concern of the HTTP specification. So because the HTTP specification is more concerned with errors such as not sending proper JSON or at all, or not sending the query as a field called exactly query, errors like that.
I challenge that specifically because I've seen frameworks that do give you the ability to post-process the errors that you get through GraphQL. And I think it needs to be enforced that I haven't seen anything that post-processes the data other than things like GraphQL Lodash, for example, which, is actually, I think, yeah, I can't remember what layer that works out. But anyway, the errors are commonly like filtered or augmented or replaced at the server level. So I think those do potentially need some superficial tests. And yes, you're right, there are certain error conditions that we can produce and make sure that they live up to it. But I think at least one user error should be tested to make sure that it does come through unbroken.
Well, I guess the presence of the data and the errors field should be like the most far we can go, or we should go. And the contents of those, I think, is subject to the GraphQL specification part.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But I am saying that some servers then fiddle with the results of that. And we should make sure that they fiddle with it in a way that remains GraphQL compliant. But I'm also open to just saying that this is beyond the scope of the project. So I personally would err on the side of checking those things. But if everyone agrees that maybe we shouldn't, then I'm happy. It's not strongly held.
I think, if that was the only thing that meant that we would have to have a shared schema between all the implementations, then that could be an argument for jettisoning that idea, just initial error checking. But I have a suspicion that we may have a whole class of tests that require us to have a schema, and therefore we might modularize into like, here's the generic test that we could run against any server just on introspection alone. And here's a set of tests that we use to further evaluate a server's compliance, but it requires some implementation of the shared schema in order to make it work.
The shared schema that I've got there has got field descriptions that quite detailed explain what the resolver does. So if we were to, export an SDL dump of that JavaScript schema, people could read that or potentially even consume and use it when they're implementing their resolvers and their chosen framework. But they'll sort of have some English descriptions to sort of just, as a sort of a template or instructional on how they should be setting up the resolvers in the descriptions.
I think we might also just modularize the test suite on that. So we have maybe a subset of the tests that can be run just on introspection, which don't require any particular implementation. Because one reason that can be really useful if you want to test the conformance of a server which you don't own, or which you maybe don't even know the language it's programmed in. So you can still just fire the test suite, edit, and get some results.
I think that's incredibly valuable.
I mean, like theoretically, we could just fire that off against the GitHub API and see whether it's compliant, right? You don't have to own the API, you don't have to run it locally, you can just put in a URL. I think that's valuable.
If we're doing that, it might make sense to add some kind of back-off algorithm or whatever, so we don't just like pummel it with like 700.
Sorry, we lost your audio.
Sorry?
I could hear.
Oh, sorry, I lost your audio.
No worries. I was basically saying, much like how curl, for example, has parameters for reducing its spidering and things like that, we may want to have a flag, or at least tell users, don't run this against an API that you don't own, because it does send X number of requests over a short period of time and you don't want to get banned, basically. Just a warning.
Have an agent in there probably as well. Be useful.
Well,
Agreed.
we can add flags and options pretty easily. So if we were to have a radically smaller subset of tests, we could either just have a flag and have an if statement that will sort of skip adding the test to the suite in the code, which would be very trivial. But if people are importing that subset, basically with tree shaking and all the rest of it and like bundle size, if people just want the small subset, we could export a separate export that would only pull in via all of the modular JavaScript stuff, just the ones they need. So we could export a different function at the top level.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, that's kind of optimization that we could just punt on for now, but if it's valuable, we could spend time on that.
Jaden, I've added a action for you just to add the user agent field just to whatever's sending the requests. I forget that's one line of code, right?
Oh, okay. Maybe would you like to raise an issue on the repo? And because I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that.
Okay. I have an action item as well. Two action items. Firstly, confirm the name, because I haven't pressed publish yet. And I intend to publish a pre-release on NPM, so people know that this is not yet a version 1. So if we're all happy with the name, what did I have? Test-GraphQL-HTTP. I wanted it to be familiar, like to the command itself. The command doesn't have to be the same as the package's name. I just think it's nice to be consistent. So if there's no objections to the name that I had, I'll go ahead and I'll publish that as my action item. I'll do a pre-release. That way you guys can experiment with NPX.
I hate arguing over names, but is there a reason that you didn't go with, for example, GraphQL HTTP test?
Because when you have the function and you're calling it, it sounds better saying that you want to test GraphQL HTTP rather than the function GraphQL HTTP test and then give it an argument. It just felt a little more intuitive. I'm open to it.
I'm fairly indifferent. Go with whatever name you like, but I personally would have called it GraphQL HTTP test. I think for the CLI at least. Maybe
okay. Maybe put the suggestion down in the notes, and so I can track people's suggestions.
I'm fairly agnostic about that. Test GraphQL HTTP sounds fine. I mean, it's like those are the 3 words, the shortest 3 words that you could use to refer to what this is. So it seems to me like the question could be ordering. That's it, really. I mean,
Benji's idea could be better in the future if the founder, if we publish a series of packages and we want them to alphabetically sort adjacent, GraphQL-HTTP foo, bar, test, whatever. So that is a consideration.
we can also scope them to the GraphQL organization. So then you could have @GraphQL/HTTP test, which would prevent anyone else from blocking up our namespace in future for other tests, as you say.
Yeah. And that's, so I don't, do we have so we have an @GraphQL namespace now, but I don't think I have publish or permission, like, I don't think I can create packages.
It's a bit of a faff to get it, but we can get that to happen now. We've managed to do so with Graphical, so it is possible. It just takes a little bit of time.
Yeah.
It
Well,
probably
it's
would
probably
come along with when this gets adopted into the GraphQL Foundation. Like until
So,
then, I think
we'll
probably
publish
won't go
it
there,
bare and for now, and then move it under a namespace later. All right.
That
Yeah.
makes perfect sense to me.
That would also be an argument to go with GraphQL HTTP test, since all that would change is the slash in the middle.
True.
Yep. Makes some sense.
When I rename the repo accordingly, the old links that I've put in here in these notes, that will redirect, GitHub will redirect.
I'm not sure if it does. I think it might give you a 4-4.
Oh, I've been in this position before. If you rename the repo, GitHub will redirect the old one.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's pretty smart.
Through multiple renames as well, like a big string of them.
Often what would happen
naming
if you rename it back again to an old name, how their redirects would then work?
I haven't tried that.
Something that we might think about is it an explicit goal that the CLI tool should be able to run against any GraphQL server?
I think that should be a goal, yes.
Yep, so the interface at the moment is it just takes a URI as the CLI argument. So you could potentially have a whole different stack running that server. It just needs to be available via URI.
Yeah, well, if that's a declared goal that we want to have, then we would need the ability to specify stuff like authentication headers.
Ah.
I agree with that need, but I think we should also punt that till later.
Yeah, I think we have room to put them in as options. So at the moment, I've got one argument on the CLI, so I didn't bother prefixing it with a flag name. It's just the first argument is the URI. So if we think that we're going to have a bunch of options for different headers and things, maybe I could change it to call it -- URI equals. Or we can just have a breaking change in the future. It doesn't matter. We're the only users of it for now.
I think URI as an argument is totally fine, since it's...
I'm going to add probably to the meeting notes from the earlier conversation we had as well about the WebSockets and are we responsible for that? Because today I was actually linking to people on GitHub this exact thing. I think it's topical.
Regarding potentially adding headers and things like that, I think it would be good to mimic a familiar web tool that's used for this purpose. So for example, curl or wget, something like that, so that we have the same kind of CLI flags as those. It would just make it very convenient. It also means we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yep. Maybe this could be an enhancement GitHub issue on that repo, and people can suggest the format of the flags. I think that whatever the CLI design of the flags is, we would then replicate the naming as a JavaScript options in the options object for the JavaScript API. And they'll just get passed straight through.
Agreed.
So I guess we'll camel case it and stuff instead of dash, just for convenience.
Looks really good. Do you guys have any more you want to talk about on this topic, or?
One of the tricky things that I found is that I'm supporting back to node 10, which is the LTS. It'll be a little bit easier for us if we just support like the bleeding edge, but I don't know, we probably should support back to LTS. The reason
Sorry to interrupt you. It goes into
Yeah.
maintenance, I believe, in April, which is like 2 months away. I just jumped straight to Node 12.
Well, that I can do that, but it won't completely negate the thing that's annoying. The vanilla node asserts libraries. When I'm snapshot testing servers that are not compliant, and we've got our assertion errors showing up in the report, the strings are different depending on the version of Node. So I've built the infrastructure to have a snapshot for each major version of Node that we're supporting, which is a little bit annoying because if you go and you change the tests and things, you now need to run the snapshot update with changing your versions of Node 3 times. So I might have a little bit of thinking about that, but I think it just is the way it is. So I might see if there's something I can do to make that nicer.
It seems like the assert library would be fairly easy to just duplicate. It might actually be, I mean, it's probably fully JavaScript, so you can probably just copy and paste it out of Node source, embed it into the project, and then you only have one version of it.
Yes, we could just use our own assertion library and get consistency that way. But nodes, for example, if you have a deep equals or something, it will actually show a diff in the error message of like which bit's wrong. So there's a lot of cool smarts you get for free.
Do the diffs change across versions? I mean.
Yep.
Ah, lame.
Yeah, the colors and things, everything. Yeah.
You must be using an assert library for the JavaScript, the browser version.
Yeah, so because I'm using the Node version, it won't run in the browser at the moment. But yeah, that would be another benefit to making our own assertion library or picking a lightweight one that's universal.
Forgive me if that's like a new question. I'm not really into Node that much, but can we use TypeScript?
Oh, I hope we don't. I'm not a fan of it, to be honest. Is there a particular reason that you would suggest it?
Yeah, it's maintainable.
Well, at the moment we don't need to have a build step.
Well, it's just that I quite enjoy working with it so far, but we don't have to use it.
I bit my tongue regarding suggesting it earlier also. Like, don't want to come across too much as a TypeScript zealot, but also it does help a lot, particularly for people who are not familiar with the library, being able to see all the autocompletes in line with the types and other such things. Some of that can be inferred from the JavaScript for things, but often it's very loose in that way. It's nice. It just makes the API a lot easier to interact with.
I'm a bit agnostic as far as it goes because I feel like if someone is interested in it, it can always be ported to TypeScript by a TypeScript zealot, as you say. That's not a hard step. So we can always make that migration. It's an easy migration going to TypeScript from JavaScript.
Just as a general note, so hopefully I don't have to put in as much effort this month. I really struggle to like find the time to do this. I'm glad I managed to. In the end, I took a day off work.
Yeah, we really appreciate that. Thanks, Jaden, for all your work. Cool. So we've got some actions for our next month down here below. Does that look good, or anything else we should, kick down the road? I think I'm pretty pretty confident about the list of tests that I should be able to get that done. And I think that's important for our kind of taking the next steps. Cool. All right. I will, I'll do what I did last week was where I posted this as an issue, like the actions, so that we can kind of see what the outcome from the notes here are. Was that helpful last week or last month?
Having the GitHub issue of action items, I thought was fantastic.
Cool. So I'll do that again. We'll link to the, the agenda and everything, but it feels it's nice to make it accessible to people who are not deep into all the agenda and the docs to see what kind of what's going on, what the plans are. And yeah, without any further ado, I guess we can call this meeting, and I'll see you guys in about a month.
Awesome. Fantastic work, everyone, particularly Jaden.
Thanks, guys.
Everybody.
Yeah, good job.
All right, take care.
See ya.
See ya.